tonight is Nic Eadie. Oh, sorry, there. Sorry. Nic Eadie. Nic's the director of the Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group. For those of you who've not come across the Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group before, they provide emotional and practical support to asylum seekers and immigration detainees in the Gatwick area. And they seek to improve conditions, inform policy and challenge negative images of refugees and asylum seekers. I mean, their work covers very practical things like going in and talking to people who are in isolation, collecting clothes, and in the past they used to also collect toiletries. Although that has now, we're no longer allowed to provide toiletries to asylum seekers, apparently on the grounds of security. I'm not quite sure why that is, but that is the role. Anyway, I'm sure Nic can tell us a bit more than that. Thank you, Nic.
Hi. That's a bit loud. Hi. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Claire. Thanks for having me here today. So I'm going to talk to you about the issue of immigration, of detention of migrants, which I think we feel certainly is an issue that tends to slip under the radar, the political and public radar. When it does seem to appear, it's often in very negative sort of headlines and connotations. So I'll just briefly introduce Claire briefly introduce the organisation, and I'll tell you a little bit more. We've been in existence for about 16 years. The core of what we do is through our visitors, who we have about 90 visitors who go in and visit individual detainees, providing emotional support while they are held in the 2 detention centres that are on the perimeter of Gatwick Airport. That's where we work. We also provide support. We also provide more detailed casework with some of the detainees, advocacy, and we're involved in lobbying and policy work in conjunction with some other organisations. Give you a brief overview of what detention is, what it means. There are around about 3,000 detention bed spaces throughout the UK in 10 main centres, plus there are about 600 prison bed spaces as well that the Border Agency pay for. So there are around about 3,500 people detained at any one time under Immigration Act powers. Now, what detention means is it's not a punitive measure, it's simply an administrative measure. Essentially, people are held in removal centres for the convenience of people in the Home Office who are usually trying to effect their removal. There are some broad categories of detainees. Asylum seekers is a very large one, often failed people who've been through the asylum process and have been unsuccessful, so-called failed asylum seekers. People who've overstayed visas, people who have arrived at the airport and have been refused. But more and more what we're seeing now is the majority of people held in removal centres are foreign nationals who serve prison sentences in the UK. So I think I'm going to focus my talk mainly on them. Although of course there's often a lot of overlap. A lot of people who we visit who've been in prison are also asylum seekers. You know, they're not exclusive categories. The power to detain people under Immigration Act powers is indefinite. So what you get is a situation where many people are held for relatively short periods of days and weeks. A significant minority are held for much longer periods. The longest I've known someone to be in detention is around about 5 years, but I've certainly heard of somebody who's been in detention, and is still in detention, has been in detention for 8 years, which is just an incredible amount of time if you consider a prison sentence. You could commit a very, very serious offence and serve a lot less time than that. Okay, so I'll move on to the issue of detaining and deporting ex-foreign nationals. It's a complex and politically very sensitive issue. I think in the public consciousness it seems a very simple issue. If you're a foreign national, you come to the UK, you commit offences, you should not be allowed to remain in the country. For many people, I think it would seem like a cut and dried issue. Of course, when you break it down, come down behind the headlines, behind the statistics, into actual human stories, then things become much cloudier. There are a number of issues I want to highlight. There are numerous detained people held in detention who cannot be removed. They are simply unremovable. You cannot just put somebody onto a plane with no documentation and expect them to be accepted. the other end. So travel document delays are a very big problem and lead to extremely long periods of detention often. There are also legal barriers to removals to certain countries. For example, Zimbabwe is a country we didn't make enforced removals to for many years, but that's now changed. Another issue, you have a lot of people who are in detention who've lived in the UK for many, many years, often have no contacts back in their countries of origin. What we see more and more is people who come to the UK as children, often as refugees, with their families, essentially grown up, not really realising that they weren't British, and then they commit, usually what happens, they commit offences, they end up in detention, and they get sent back to places where they literally know nobody, often don't speak the language, have nothing, and they just disappear often into this black hole. A number of people we support commit what you might term immigration-related offences. Probably the most common offence that we see is people who are working illegally in this country using false documentation. It's an offence that the courts take very seriously, often with a 12-month plus sentence, which means automatic deportation. The detainees essentially are punished 3 times over for their criminal offences. They serve a prison sentence. Often they end up in detention for longer than the period of time they spend in prison, and then they're deported. This kind of triple punishment. The issue is clearly a very politically sensitive one, and we've certainly found that politicians are hesitant to address the issues. I think essentially it's a vote loser. It's difficult for politics. We found it difficult to engage with politicians on the issue. The result really is that the border agency have these unchecked powers, and many people are staying in detention for months and months and years with no prospect of removal. Detention costs around about £110 per detainee per night. What this means is approximately £200 million a year is spent on detaining migrants in this country. About 25,000 people go through removal centres per year. Recent research has shown that of those detainees who have been held for more than 1 year, only 1/3 of them actually get deported in the end. So there's a huge waste of public money. Further research on the economic impact of detention has demonstrated that there could be potential savings of £75 million a year. We are in our campaigning and our lobbying work, we essentially have a twin track. We are campaigning on the fact that the human cost is enormous, but that's a very difficult argument to make, or can be a very difficult argument to make. The cost issue is certainly one that we're trying to push a lot more. A recent report by my organisation that is actually yet to be published has shown that detention has a hugely negative impact on mental health. We interviewed 9 detainees who've been detained for more than 1 year. The results were feelings of hopelessness, powerlessness, uncertainty and injustice arising from the very nature of detention itself. Essentially, it's not very surprising, but the longer you're detained, the worse your mental health gets. And it is the detention often that causes these mental health problems. So we are working with a number of other organisations to try to push the issue onto the political agenda, but it is proving difficult. Few politicians, particularly in the Commons, are willing to engage on the issue, despite growing evidence that it is inefficient, it's dysfunctional, and above all, it's inhumane. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. And hopefully everyone realises that the Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group do some absolutely incredible work on behalf of people that are vilified in the press and ignored by much of society and really deserve our support. Our next speaker